What is a Bible verse that you find yourself returning to again and again? A verse in which you find strength and comfort, hope and peace. If I had to guess, at least some of you here went straight to Jeremiah 29:11. As I learned it, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. We can find this verse painted on coffee mugs, hung beautifully as artwork in homes, and written on Christian graduation cards as a way to encourage those graduates who will soon head off to college. I've written it on some of those cards myself. This verse is constantly among the most popular verses from the Bible. In 2022, the UK strand of World Vision conducted a study on popular Bible verses in each country. And the way they studied this was by analyzing Bible Gateway and Google searches to find what the most searched for passages in the Bible were. Far and away, John 3:16 was the most popular verse with over 2 million searches during the time frame they studied. But coming in first in several countries and tied for second overall was Jeremiah 29:11, with over 82,000 searches in that time frame. In 2023, the website Bible Study Tools listed it as the number 2 verse in their top 10 verses in the Bible. In 2024, Southern Living listed Jeremiah 29:11 under the category Bible verses that celebrate God's love. And I came across one blog post off of a quick Google search that had a post entitled 75 Verses That Got Me Through Med School, with Jeremiah 29:11 under the title, God has a good purpose for your life in this journey. Clearly, this verse resonates. And yes, this verse can provide hope and give us a sense of peace about God's dreams for our life. But as we often do with Scripture, many of us take the verse as it stands alone and use it in ways that don't do full justice to the context in which the verse actually speaks. Jeremiah 29 as a whole collects several letters that were sent back and forth between the newly deported exiles from Judah who had been carried off into Babylon somewhere around the year 597 BCE. The parts of the chapter we read today are a part of a letter that Jeremiah, who is still in Judah, wrote to those exiles in Babylon. Now put yourself for just 1 second in the shoes of those people who had been carried off. Your people had just been defeated in battle, and to add insult to injury, you've been carried off from the life you built for yourself in Judah and forced to march over 800 miles away from the only home you've ever known, all the while having a crisis of faith, asking questions like, how could God let this happen? Doesn't God care? How can we carry on as a people? How will we worship without a temple to go to? Is this God even worth worshiping? How long will this deportation last? And you can imagine the confusion, the inner conflict, and the crisis of identity that would have been a part of this journey to Babylon. Then they arrive and wonder, what do we do now? In response to this question, some of the prophets who had been carried off to Babylon were prophesying that the exile would be over soon, that Babylon would be judged and everyone would get to return home somewhere within 2 years. And the purpose of Jeremiah's letter in chapter 29 is not primarily for comfort. For as we will see, the hope that he offers is mixed in with a touch of pretty harsh realism. But the primary message Jeremiah gives to these people in exile is this: buckle up, buttercup, you're going to be there a while. Or, as Jeremiah actually says, Don't listen to those voices around you. God didn't send them. You will return only after 70 years are completed. The problem, although 70 years might not have been meant to be a literal figure, it likely does stand for a lifetime. In other words, what Jeremiah is saying, that the vast majority of the people who are hearing these words will never actually return home. Not exactly the "for I know the good plans I have for you" that most of us take away from Jeremiah 29:11. How many of us would write that on a graduation card if baked into the message was you're going to leave, have a crisis of identity, question the existence and faithfulness of God, and never actually return home? I don't think many of us would write that on a card. Walter Brueggemann, a renowned Old Testament scholar who also carried throughout his career a fascination with the book of Jeremiah, points out that this letter combats two separate but equally unhelpful responses to the crisis brought on by exile. While both of these responses are completely normal for anyone who is facing crisis, Brueggemann sees God's message to the people as pushing back against them. One response might be a false optimism. This can look like simply ignoring the fact that you are in a crisis, or facing the crisis by insisting that it will be short-lived. As the prophets in Babylon were saying, you will only be here 2 years. But Jeremiah sees this response as unhelpful. On the one hand, it would have left the people in a constant state of limbo, always expecting the trip home and never living their lives fully present in the moment. It also removes from the people in exile the responsibility of living a life of purpose within their present circumstances. We'll get to more on that in a moment. The other response Brueggemann points out is a deep and utter despair, a belief that nothing will ever change, that God has indeed abandoned them, their lives have no meaning or purpose. They might as well wallow in misery because they will never get to go home. But Jeremiah sees this also as unhelpful, for it removes hope from the people. But God's message to God's people in this moment of crisis moves them in the direction of purpose, perseverance, and obedience. I think this is important for us as well, for we too encounter exile moments in our lives. Moments of crisis that interrupt our comfortable journey and make us wonder where God is and what God might be doing. When the life we've spent time and energy building falls apart. When we experience a trauma that leaves us afraid and anxious, unsure and unsafe, yearning to get back to that elusive feeling of comfort and safety. We all know what it's like for the future to feel unstable and uncertain and question whether or not God will actually be there if we fall. We know what it's like for our faith to be shaken by questions, when the old answers no longer carry authority or satisfaction like they once did, and we're left only with the questions that now we feel have no answers. We know what it's like to face life-altering moments, life-changing diagnoses, to suffer the pain of loss, to worry about our children or grandchildren, and to wonder what church might look like in 30 years. Yes, we all experience moments of crisis. And we too might be tempted to respond with false optimism or despair. After all, we all know people who go through difficult seasons of life, but when asked how they are doing, will always say, "Oh, I'm good." Or my personal favorite, "I'm good, life's good, everything's good, #blessed." As if not talking about it with people who care about them will somehow make the circumstances change quicker. We also know people who, when going through difficult moments, seem to shut down and lean into despair, developing an identity that is centered in that struggle, or whose despair leads them to seeking solace in unhelpful patterns of life that might drown the crisis, but lack any sense of hope or living meaningful lives in the midst of it. And maybe that person who is facing crisis who is tempted to respond with a false optimism or despair is you. And you are here this morning asking the difficult questions, wondering where God is. Is God faithful? Why is this happening? Does God really care? And how long before I experience deliverance? Maybe Jeremiah's message in these verses can speak life and meaning into that crisis. Because instead of a false optimism or despair, Jeremiah's letter to the exiles encourages them to live lives of purpose, perseverance, and obedience. Notice in verse 5, God, through Jeremiah, is speaking to the exiles and commands them, build homes, live in them. Plant gardens, eat what they produce. Marry, see that your children marry. Seek the welfare of the city where I sent you and pray for it. In other words, Jeremiah is saying, settle in, accept your circumstances. Don't avoid them with a false optimism, but embrace your current reality and find ways to live a life of purpose and meaning in the midst of it. Not in spite of it, not because it will soon end, but in the midst of the crisis, in the midst of the exile, live a life of purpose and meaning. The Hebrew word for welfare here is the word shalom. It's a theologically rich word. On the one hand, it does mean peace in the sense of absence of conflict, but on a deeper level means well-being, wholeness, being physically, emotionally, spiritually healthy. And God is telling these people who have just been ripped from their homes, wondering what life could ever be like in Babylon, and he tells them, seek the shalom of the city they find themselves in. Seek the shalom of the people and places you encounter in the midst of your exile. Now remember, the Babylonians were their enemies. They were their captors. They were the people who had just deported them from their homes and removed them from the only lives they've ever known. And God is saying, seek the shalom, the well-being of this place, of these people. Pray for them. It sounds a lot like Jesus' command to love your enemies and pray for those who mistreat you. On a deeper level, these people would have inevitably been wondering, what does it look like to live a purposeful and meaningful religious life 800 miles removed from the temple, where sacrifices could be offered, where they believed God could be encountered? And God says, build homes, plant gardens, seek to bless, seek the shalom, thrive where you are planted. If you are currently going through a crisis moment, instead of trying to escape it, what might it look like to lean into it? Instead of responding with a false optimism, how can you settle in and live a purpose-filled life in the midst of it? Jeremiah also encourages them to live lives of perseverance. And this perseverance is founded in a vision of the future that sustains and orients their actions in the present. 70 years you will be in Babylon. Effectively, many of them would never see a change in their circumstances actually become a reality. But they took hope in the Lord, who was saying, I will fulfill my promise to you as a people. Not to them as individuals, but you as a people. Why? How could they be sure of this? For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans for your welfare. There's that Hebrew word shalom again. Not your harm, to give you a future with hope. Jeremiah says, live lives of perseverance, not because your circumstances will change, but because God promises that one day, as you live in hope, your people's circumstances will change. Your descendants' circumstances will change. Don't fall into despair, but lean into this message of hope. Things will change, but not for you. Imagine what would have happened if the people hadn't leaned into this message of hope. Despair is a quality that can easily be passed down from generation to generation. Can cause a deep sadness that perpetuates itself, or the despair of one generation can give birth to a deep anger and bitterness in the next. And God says, that's not what I want for you. Persevere. Trust in my promise, even as you know that it's not going to be realized with you. I actually have good plans in the midst of your exile. Finally, God's message to the people in exile: live lives of obedience. Trust that when you pray, I will hear. That when you seek me, when you seek with all your heart, you will find me. And then at the end of those 70 years, probably less a specific time frame and more an indication of the exile being completed or a lifetime, I will return you as a people to your home. In the meantime, God says, obey, build, plant, seek the welfare of the city, persevere, seek me with all your heart, trusting you will find me, pray, trusting I will hear, and do all of this knowing the promise will not be realized for you. I think too often when we quote Jeremiah 29:11, we fall into two streams of thought. One, we use it on greeting cards to affirm that those who already have good coming their way, going off to college, even if it might be a difficult moment, can trust in the good hopes and dreams that God has for them. And although this is 100% true, it doesn't do complete justice to the circumstances of those to whom this message was initially given. And second, even if we are using it in a more appropriate circumstance, like sharing it with a friend who's going through a difficult season, what we often are trying to communicate is that God will work it all out, that God will rescue us from the circumstances. But looking at the full context of this letter, God is actually saying something different. God is saying your individual circumstances won't change, but the circumstances for you as my people one day will. And the question seems to be, are you willing to live lives of purpose, perseverance, and obedience, even though the rescue will not come? Will you accept the transformation that can occur in the midst of your circumstances, even if they never change? And this is a question that confronts each and every one of us in our own personal moments of crisis. God is still working. God is still dreaming. God is still opening up avenues of transformation. God still has good plans, but they don't always involve rescue from our circumstances. Sometimes those good plans involve transformation in the midst of them. And if that is the case, are you willing to continue to trust in God? To believe that God really does indeed care, even if your circumstances remain unchanged? Can we continue to live lives of purpose and perseverance and obedience, even if we never fully experience rescue, but find the good in that present moment in the midst of the trial? I wonder if the message some of us need to hear is not the "for I know the plans I have for you," but rather the build and plant, seek and pray. Embrace the difficult season of your life and commit to living faithful and fruitful lives in the midst of it. This seems to me a much more realistic and helpful response to the realities of life. If you find yourself in a difficult season, I wish I could stand up here and confidently tell you it will be over soon, that rescue is on the horizon. But the truth is, I don't know. None of us do. But we can be confident in this: we can live lives of purpose, lives of perseverance, and lives of obedience in the midst of the crisis, regardless of our circumstances. Not only is it possible, but that is the call of Jeremiah 29. God is with you. God doesn't abandon you. And God has called you to a life of purpose and perseverance and obedience. And that, my friends, is a call worth leaning into.